Classroom management is one of the key English language teaching skills. It involves making sure that your different types of students get enough talking time. So for example, that your quieter students participate and your more talkative students don't dominate. It also involves managing the different personalities that you have in your class. Classroom management can become somewhat challenging and, quite frankly, unpredictable when we add aggressive student behavior into the mix. We're going to look at this in this session. So we're going to take a look at aggressive student behavior from the perspective of frameworks from intercultural communication, education, and counseling. We'll look at how these frameworks can be used to understand the aggressive student behavior that we're seeing. We'll look at some real-life scenarios and use these frameworks to analyze the scenarios and come up with practical strategies that we can use as teachers to both manage, mitigate, and also prevent aggressive student behavior. We'll start the session by looking at different definitions of aggression. Then we'll take a look at the signs or ways to identify aggressive student behavior. We'll take some time to delve into the possible causes of this aggressive behavior. Then we'll look at strategies with which to manage the behavior when it happens in our classrooms. Finally, we'll look at preventative strategies. How do we stop this aggressive student behavior from happening in the first place? Let's get started. Here's an example of when aggressive student behavior might happen and what it might look like in an English language classroom. You may have experienced this scenario yourself. So you're handing back tests that you just finished marking, and student A receives her test, and she looks very upset, so she gets a really hard look on her face. After getting her test back, she doesn't participate anymore in the class. As soon as the class is finished, she jumps up, comes really, really close to you, puts her face right in front of your face, and yells, "You had better change the mark on my test. I don't like this mark. I didn't deserve this mark. I deserve a much better mark. You better pass me or else." Her face gets really red, she's got a very angry look on her face, and her fists are clenched. So this is an example of when aggressive student behavior might happen in your class. With the scenario I just described in mind, let's take a look at some of the definitions that are out there for the concept of aggression. These definitions come to us from different fields, including education, counseling, intercultural communication, and also psychology. We'll start with a classic definition of aggression just taken from dictionary.com. So in the dictionary, aggression is defined as overt or suppressed hostility. And this can be innate hostility, natural hostility, or as a result of being in a very frustrating situation. And the hostility can be directed either inward towards the person themselves or outwards towards other people. So that's our starting point, just a classic definition of aggression. Now we'll take a look at a definition that contrasts aggression with violence. So aggression is defined as something that is emotional and very symbolic. Violence, however, is when there's actual physical damage done to either a person or an object or a location. So this is an important contrast because later on we'll talk about the need to stop aggression from actually turning into or escalating into violence. The next definition of aggression comes to us from Maslow. This definition divides aggression into natural aggression and pathological aggression. Natural aggression is considered to be positive. It results from a situation in which there's a perception about some kind of injustice or in a self-defense situation. Pathological aggression, on the other hand, is considered to be an inherited condition, or it's also considered to be a mental illness. This definition is important to us as English language teachers because we may actually experience either kind of aggression in the classroom. And it's really helpful for us to know that the aggression might be as a result of the circumstances creating this feeling of frustration, or it might be as a result of simply who the person is. The next definition of aggression also has two categories. It comes to us from Buss. The first category is hostile aggression, and this is aggression that's simply there in order to hurt people. The second category is instrumental aggression, and this is aggression that is used as a means to an end. So the person has an end goal in mind. We can further divide instrumental aggression into two more categories. One has the end goal being to correct an injustice or to fix a problem, and then the other one has the end goal of controlling people. So the first one is positive and the second one is negative. The next definition of aggression has three categories. These are instinct, frustration, and social learning. With instinct aggression, the person is being aggressive simply in reaction to a particular situation that's probably threatening. So this is the self-defense aggression. With the frustration aggression, the person is having difficulty achieving his or her goals or objectives. So their frustration is just building up and coming out as aggressive behavior. With social learning aggression, however, the person is actually simply following behaviors that have been modeled in the past by group members. So, for example, in our case, a student may come from a cultural background in which aggressive behavior is actually acceptable and it's modeled all the time. So the student's simply following culturally accepted behavior. And this makes social learning particularly important for us as English language teachers because it's a really important key to the puzzle of student aggression in our classes. The final conceptualization of aggression comes to us from Patterson, and this comes to us from the field of counseling. Patterson says that there are 5 components to aggression. So these components are behavior, nonverbal communication, beliefs, emotions, and goals. So let's take a look at each one of these components in a bit more detail. The behavior component of aggression sees the aggressive person dismiss, insult, or ignore the feeling, wants, and opinions of other people. So the person behaves as if the feelings and ideas of other people simply don't matter. The nonverbal communication component of aggression sees the aggressive person make eye contact directly with the person that they're trying to threaten. It sees the aggressive person trying to make themselves really large and tall. I can never do that, I'm too short. And it also sees the aggressive person getting very loud with his or her voice to the point of shouting and yelling. The beliefs component of aggression is interesting because it lets us start to dig into the mind of the person who's being aggressive. So an aggressive person believes that he or she has rights, but no one else does. And the aggressive person believes in his or her own value, but no one else's value. Everyone else is considered to be worthless. The emotions component of aggression is also interesting. The primary or driving emotions behind aggression are anger and frustration. So in the moment or in the aggressive episode, the person is just really, really angry. After the aggressive episode, the person actually might feel some guilt or self-hatred, but in the moment, it's all driven by anger and frustration. Finally, the goal of an aggressive person is to win at any cost and to control other people or the situation also at any cost. So in this person's mind, the end goal of winning justifies the means. Now that we've looked at these different and very informative definitions of aggression, let's move on to take a look at the signs of aggression. So these are the signs that you watch out for in order to know that a student is being aggressive. The signs can be divided into verbal signs, nonverbal signs, and other signs. So let's take a look at what these are. Verbal signs of aggression are sudden outbursts, shouting, swearing, personal insults, name-calling, racial or sexual comments, threats, sarcasm, spreading rumors or slander, and verbal harassment. Nonverbal signs of aggression are an angry facial expression, staring and direct eye contact, invading personal space, threatening or violent gestures, threatening posture, clenched jaw, clenched fists, nervous pacing, restlessness, tightly gripping objects, pushing, shoving, hitting, and punching. Other signs of aggression include agitation, sweating, red face, fast heart rate, emotional abuse, manipulating friendships, excluding others from a group, and signs of drug and/or alcohol use. We've looked at definitions of aggression and signs of aggression. Now let's take a look at the factors that create or contribute to aggressive student behavior. The challenge here is that there's no single one factor at any point in time that creates that aggressive student behavior. The aggressive student behavior is always the result of multiple factors all coalescing at a single moment in time to create that aggressive student behavior. These factors can be divided into 4 categories. So we have circumstantial factors, environmental factors, cultural factors, and individual factors. Circumstantial factors that can cause aggressive student behavior include the following: the breakup of an important relationship, the death of a close family member, the serious illness of a close family member, financial instability, recent loss of a job, or ongoing lack of employment. Environmental factors that can contribute to or cause aggressive student behavior include economically or socially disadvantaged living conditions and unsafe living conditions. So these may be conditions in which there are gangs, drug dealing, and other criminal activity. Cultural factors that can cause or contribute to aggressive student behavior include cultural differences in terms of what aggressive behavior actually is, the acceptability of public displays of emotion in a particular culture, ascribed status in that culture, and the power distance in a culture. Finally, individual factors that can contribute to or cause aggression include poor emotional control, poor social skills, social isolation or detachment, a need for power, a need for control, a learning disability, low self-esteem, serious personal illness, mental health issues, post-traumatic stress, culture shock, and drug or alcohol use. Let's take a closer look at the cultural factors that can cause or contribute to aggressive student behavior. These cultural factors are particularly relevant to us as English language teachers because we're working with a very culturally diverse student group. So we've got different cultures interacting and they all have different assumptions about aggression. So let's take a look at some of these cultural factors. First, cultures differ in terms of what behavior is actually considered to be aggressive. So in one culture, a certain behavior could be considered aggressive. In another culture, the same behavior could just be considered normal behavior. Let's take an example. So personal space. So cultures differ in terms of the amount of personal space that's usually allowed when 2 people are face-to-face and interacting. In a culture that likes large personal space, if someone moves closer, this is considered aggressive behavior. But in a culture that normally has small personal space, being really close to someone is normal. It's not considered to be aggressive behavior. And we have the same thing with other signs of aggression, such as speaking quickly and speaking loudly, making direct eye contact, and using your hands a lot. In some cultures, this is considered aggressive. In other cultures, it's considered normal. Another cultural factor that can come into play in our English language classrooms is a culture's acceptance of public displays of emotion. In some cultures, it's perfectly okay to exhibit a wide range of emotion in public. In other cultures, it's not acceptable, so people are expected to keep their emotions in check. So if I come from a culture that accepts public displays of a wide range of emotions, and I'm in a culture that doesn't accept those public displays, I may actually be perceived as being aggressive, even though I'm not. Status is another cultural factor that can cause aggressive student behavior. Cultures differ in terms of how they give somebody status. And by status, I mean high regard or power. In some cultures, they have what's called ascribed status. That means I get status or power simply because of who I am. In other cultures, they have what's called achieved status. I have to earn my power. We sometimes get students being aggressive when they don't receive the status that they would actually expect in their own culture. This usually happens, or it happens most often, when someone's going from an ascribed status culture into an achieved status culture. They simply don't have the power and the high regard that they would expect themselves to have based on who they are. And then they get frustrated, and then they get aggressive. A final interesting cultural factor that can contribute to aggressive student behavior is the concept of power distance. Power distance means how acceptable it is in a culture for someone who has power to show that power. In a high power distance culture, there's a big power difference between people with lots of power and people with no power. And it's totally okay for these people with power to show that they have power. So they might have fancy clothes, big houses, drive nice cars. People might have to bow when they meet them. All these different ways that we show someone they have power over us. In a low power distance culture, even though someone has power, they're really not allowed to show it. So it's not acceptable to throw your power and authority around. If you take someone from a high power distance culture and put them into a low power distance culture, you can see them getting really frustrated because they think they have a lot of power, but they're not allowed to show it. This can lead to frustration, which in turn can lead to aggressive behavior. The real takeaway from this discussion on the causes or the factors that create or contribute to student aggression is that the origin of student aggression is really, really complex. It is never a single factor that's at play. It's always multiple factors. So in order to figure out what's going on and what's caused this student behavior, you have to ask a lot of questions. So those 4 categories of factors can form the framework of your questioning. So you can ask questions to dig in and find out, are there any circumstantial factors? Are there environmental factors? Are there cultural factors? And are there individual factors? Only by asking all of these questions and delving into the complexity can you get a real understanding of what's causing that aggressive student behavior. Once you have aggressive student behavior at play in your class, you need to implement strategies in order to both manage and then eventually diffuse that aggressive behavior. Let's take a look at things you should do and also should not do in order to manage and diffuse that aggression. Here are the things you should do. Stay calm, be polite, maintain a confident and commanding presence, keep your personal safety and the safety of the staff and students paramount. Keep your distance, use barriers if the student becomes violent, mentally identify an escape route, and keep others out of harm's way. Focus on the emotion being displayed, not the content being said. Ask questions in order to find out which factors are causing the student aggression. Relate to the student as a person. Separate the person from the aggressive behavior. Give the student clear choices about how to resolve the situation. Exhibit empathy, but not sympathy. Use active listening. These are sounds to show you are listening and also paraphrasing and clarifying. Demonstrate that you understand the student's emotions. Use phrases such as, you sound, ... it sounds like you are, ... Set limits for the student. For example, I can help you if you calm down and tell me what you need. Use silence as a tool to calm the situation down. Immediately report any behavior that is violent or looks like it will turn to violence, and report this either to security or to the police. Here are things you shouldn't do because these actions will actually inflame the situation. So you shouldn't behave reactively, show anger or fear, respond to aggression with your own aggression, issue threats or use threatening nonverbal communication, make promises you can't keep, make false statements, explain technical, complicated information when emotions are high, take sides, disagree, or assign blame, patronize, belittle or criticize the person or make him or her feel foolish, bargain. However, you can negotiate, just don't bargain. And finally, don't try to disarm someone who is armed. Call 911 or security. These lists of do's and don'ts for managing and diffusing aggressive student behavior should be part of your regular classroom management toolbox. Always keep these in the back of your mind, know they're there, and if you do have an aggressive student situation unfolding, use these strategies. We've talked about things you can do to manage and diffuse aggressive student behavior in your class. Now we're going to take a look at things you can do to prevent that behavior from occurring in the first place. Here's the first strategy. Have a code of conduct that all of the students and also all of the staff agree to follow. Students should sign this agreement on the first day of class, and they keep a copy and you keep a copy. Staff should sign the agreement on their first day of employment or as part of their contract. Next, set clear expectations about what student behavior is acceptable and also not acceptable in your classroom. Also set clear boundaries about how students are to interact and the student and the teacher are to interact. It's a really good idea on the very first day of class to actually have students set these expectations themselves. Make a list, post them on the wall, and then everyone knows what these expectations are, and everyone has to follow them because they participated in writing these expectations. Next, be open to directly discussing aggression with your students. Talk about what aggression is versus assertiveness. So aggression is negative and not acceptable, but assertiveness is positive and acceptable. Also be open to talking about cultural differences in terms of aggression. Talk about how different behaviors may be perceived as aggressive in one culture and not aggressive in another culture. So really be open to having direct discussions with your students about the concept of aggression. Next, you want to serve as a model to your students. So you want to model assertiveness, which is being very direct and very confident, but not trying to get control. And you don't want to model things like passiveness and passive aggressiveness and aggressiveness. So be a model for your students about what types of behaviors are acceptable and not acceptable in your classroom. Next, keep detailed notes about aggressive student behavior that you see in your classroom. Note if this aggressive student behavior is getting worse over time so that you can flag it and have a conversation with your manager and with the student about this behavior before it gets to a point where it can't be resolved. With your fellow teachers, have a professional development session on student aggressive behavior. So work your fellow teachers through the definitions of aggression, the signs of aggression, the factors that contribute to aggression, and strategies for managing aggression. Make sure all of the teachers in your school have a really solid understanding of how to manage aggressive student behavior. Finally, if managing and preventing aggressive student behavior is really of interest to you as a topic, I would recommend taking further professional development. There are a lot of really good conflict resolution training programs out there that will take you into these issues and into this information in a lot more detail. We've gone through a lot of information about aggressive student behavior. We've looked at definitions of aggression, signs of aggression, factors that contribute to aggression, and also strategies for both managing and preventing aggression in our classrooms. What I'd like you to do now is take a look at page 7 on your handout. I've given you 5 different scenarios, and these are scenarios based on real events. These are real instances of aggressive student behavior in an English language classroom. Read each scenario and do 3 things. First of all, look at the scenario from the perspective of the definitions of aggression. Which definitions apply here? Second, look at the scenarios from the perspective of factors that contribute to aggression. So what do you think some possible factors are that created this scenario? Finally, take a look at it from the perspective of managing the student aggression. If you were the teacher in this situation, what would you do? As you worked through these scenarios, you probably realized that you really have no idea what's going on. Any of the definitions could apply, the aggression could be the result of any of the factors, and quite a few different strategies might be necessary or might work in this situation. And that's what I really want you to take away. Remember before I said that aggression is a really complex issue and you don't really know what's causing it until you start asking questions. So remember this, the very first thing you have to do is ask questions and dig deeper in order to figure out what's going on. In these scenarios, literally anything is possible. So what I'm going to do for each scenario, rather than going through all the possibilities, we'd be here for hours if I did that, is I'm going to take you through what really were the factors contributing to this scenario and then the strategies that this particular teacher used in order to manage the aggression. So let's get started. The main contributing factor to the aggressive student behavior in scenario A is a cultural factor. For student B, it was simply not culturally appropriate to listen to the music that student A was playing in the presentation. There was also a personal or individual factor at play in that student B was just a very controlling personality. So that came into it as well. And there were a few other factors, but those were the two main ones. What the teacher did in this situation was, first of all, allow student B to stay out of the classroom. The teacher didn't go running after student B to try and bring him back in. And then the teacher reassured student A that it was okay to continue with his presentation. After class, the teacher sat down with both student B and the program manager and talked through what acceptable behavior would have been in that particular cultural context and that situation. There were two main factors contributing to scenario B. The first factor was a circumstantial one. Student A and student B simply had an unpleasant past. Okay? They had historical reasons for not liking each other. And then there was an individual factor as well. The aggressive student simply had poor social skills and didn't know how to handle having this other student in the class. So the student chose to be aggressive. How the teacher handled this was, first of all, talk to the aggressive student outside of class and draw boundaries and say, here's what acceptable behavior is in this situation, and then have a corresponding conversation with the other student just to make sure that student was comfortable being in the same class with the aggressive student. In scenario C, there are clearly circumstantial factors at play. One student believes the other student stole her boyfriend. There are also some cultural factors at play. With the aggressive student, she comes from a culture where it's acceptable to get that close to somebody, and it's also acceptable to yell or shout. What the teacher did in this situation was once again have private conversations individually with each of the students. With the aggressive student, she explained behavioral expectations in this particular school. With the student who was the target of the aggressive behavior, she just checked that that student was okay and would be comfortable continuing to have the aggressive student in the class. With the aggressive student, the teacher also requested that the student make an apology. Scenario D also had a very clear circumstantial factor. The student who's being aggressive in this situation had a very high level of test-taking anxiety. It didn't take much to set him off. What the teacher did in this situation was simply allow the test to continue. At the end of the test, she talked to the aggressive student just to make sure that student was okay and to make sure that student understood that that level of yelling and aggression could not happen again. At the end of the test, the teacher also reiterated to the whole class the importance of, first of all, not whispering and not making noise during a test. Scenario E has a few different factors at play. The first is circumstantial. You simply have two students from different countries that have a long and difficult history together working on the same activity. If they weren't asked to work on that same activity, probably the aggressive situation would not have arisen. You've also got some individual factors at play, however. These two individuals have both clearly not processed this difficult history of their two countries, and so they're simply not able to deal with communicating with someone from the other country. What the teacher did in this situation is actually call security, because you may have noticed that this situation went from aggression to violence. And once that happens, the teacher needs to bring in outside help to help deal with the violence and stop it from escalating. Thereafter, both the teacher and the program manager had very direct conversations with the two students. They were asked if they would be able to work together in the same class. The answer was no, so they were separated. We don't usually like to do that. We don't usually like to separate people who can't work together because that is not going to help them in the real world. However, in this particular situation, all parties deemed that that was the best course of action. I want to make a final comment about these scenarios. I've given you a very simplified explanation of the factors that contributed to the scenarios, as well as a very simplified version of the strategies that the teachers in these scenarios used. Remember that student aggression is a very complex issue. There is no one factor that contributes to student aggression, and there's no one strategy that's going to work with every situation of student aggression that arises. Hopefully through this session, you've got enough information to work with so that you can generate really good questions to start to delve into this complexity and really good strategies to use when you do encounter student aggression in your classroom. All the best with this very difficult and very challenging aspect of classroom management.